Here we go. So thanks every. Oh, perfect. We just. So as probably a lot of people know, I had the good fortune, with the support of lots of club members or board members, to take a pretty amazing trip from Indy down to the Grand Caymans and come back. And I had very lucky weather as well for this time of year. I fully assumed that it would get called off at the 11th hour, but overall had pretty clear skies and got to make a really neat trip. So I kind of wanted to just talk a little bit about the trip. This is by no means a comprehensive overview of flying in the Caymans or in the Caribbean or that part of the world, but just kind of a little overview of my flight, the route that I chose, and what kind of special considerations, and of course being over the water, what I thought about with survival equipment, and then what resources I had used, what it takes to fly over Cuba, and then of course a couple photos for the end. So the flight left from from the home of 21 Delta, and then we stopped in Chattanooga, and I say we because the majority of this flight going south was with the good company of Mr. Tom Eaton, who was assisting me on my checkout in 21 Delta, and was excellent company for the trip. And we stopped in Chattanooga, had some barbecue. Perry Foley got probably the cheapest gas anywhere in the area, and then continued on down to Pagefield, which is kind of a neat general aviation spot. I stopped at, and Tom flew back from there. Probably got the cheapest airplane flight on commercial that I've ever paid for, $39 nonstop from there back to Indy.
Did you have to stand up?
Yeah. They put him in, yeah. So down to Marathon, and that was mainly to just have the maximum amount of fuel to then make the crossing to Grand Cayman. You can kind of just get a little sense of what each of the legs were. There were some route deviation, of course, but from Marathon down to Grand Cayman is about 325 nautical miles. Looking at the route a little bit more specifically, this is pretty much what I filed and got something close to that. I'll talk about it more in a minute, but you do have to be IFR over Cuba. And so the kind of the distance is, it's about 100 miles to get to land in Cuba from Marathon, 100 nautical miles. And then from Cayo Largo, which is UCL, down to the Grand Cayman, it's about 140 nautical miles. Then coming back, I just took a little bit different route, stopped in the Charlotte area to visit a friend on the way back, and then shot straight into Indy. And that flight from Charlotte to Indy was rather long, an extra hour or so, just because of, yeah, I had like 40, I think it was at one point 50 or 60 knot headwinds. So
I planned it that way, just to
yeah. He was out there going like this. No. So all told, it was probably about 2,700 nautical miles of flying, and that's a long time in 21 Delta, but it was a lot of fun. And so what kind of stuff, just, the big question, of course, is this section, the water stuff, and what sort of stuff was I thinking about? Of course, fuel. Even down to Grand Cayman, if I switch back, there are other, the Cayman Islands are 3 islands, and each island actually has an airport. But the distance between them, it's probably in that airplane maybe 30, 40 minutes of flying. So even if that was going to be your alternate, you really needed to think about it. From Marathon, on full tanks, you could make it from Marathon, find out that the airport was closed in Grand Cayman, turn around and make it back to Marathon on the tanks. So I felt pretty comfortable with that. I was hoping not to have, although there's actually pretty good, friendly GA reception in Cuba, I figured that would be a big hassle, and so I'd rather go overhead. So, and then there's also, I didn't capture the whole WAC chart here, but there's a bunch of stuff off to the east that would be alternates if for some reason you couldn't turn around and go back. We sort of talked about leg distances overall, but on the kind of USA to Cuba section, there was probably about 25 minutes over the water where I was out of glide distance. And then on the next section from Cuba down to the Grand Cayman, it was about 45 minutes. So not, that's sort of the no wind conditions. So not short, but not long. The IFR operations are a little sticky because everybody assumes that you have GPS today, the Cubans, the people in Grand Cayman, but our airplanes, although they have GPS, we don't have the databases, so everything had to be VOR only, and that pretty much worked out fine. I got a few kind of funny, wait, why can't you go to this random waypoint that I've just given you? But it was not an issue. Weather, of course, those are long distances out over the water. The U.S. weather maps do cover, if you look in your ForeFlight or on the NOAA website, they do cover pretty well down there. But you don't have quite the same level of access to information, and I'll show you some resources that I found that were really excellent and helpful. And then kind of survival gear and ditching. I'll make the comment about ditching. There's a lot of, because I read a lot about it, just trying to decide if I was a crazy man for making this flight or not. And there are some great articles out there where people have gone through all of the ditching accidents with general aviation aircraft and tried to find various trends. And some of the things that we commonly think of as, gee, you're better off in a retractable airplane than a fixed gear airplane, stuff like that, doesn't necessarily bear out in the data. I think probably a retractable airplane is still better than not, unless you're in the Cirrus, that's probably the safest. But there is a lot of good resources out there, and although I didn't have time to do it, I think there are some really good classes where they stick you in a fake airplane and dunk you in a swimming pool, and those kind of survival classes, and then they flip it over once or twice and they make you try to swim out. So some of that would be good to do if I was doing this kind of flying on a regular basis, but I was able to read a lot and felt like I learned a lot about hopefully, in a situation that hopefully I wouldn't encounter. The FARs do have a few things to say about the matter, but surprisingly less that's applicable to us than you might discover. So 91-205, this is, talks all about just general aviation and any civil aircraft, what you need to have, and there's this B12 part where they talk about, needing to have stuff if you're a certain distance offshore, but this is only for airplanes that are operated for hire over water, so that really isn't to us. There's another much longer section, this 91-509, but that's listed under the subpart F, which only applies to large and turbine-powered multi-engine airplanes and fractional ownership program aircraft. And so this technically really doesn't apply to us either, but it does have some good guidance. And so I kind of tried to go along with the spirit of this law and go read each of these and think, okay, why did they say that, and should I have that piece of equipment with me? And so this is the life preservers, life rafts, pyrotechnic signaling devices, throw cushions, and how to mount or have that stuff available to you should you need it. It shouldn't be like underneath your luggage in the tail of the airplane. So kind of what I ended up settling on was an inflatable life vest that I wore anytime I was over water, and it was the kind that you could pull the cord and then it would pop open. One of the things that I kind of read about and then noted was that a lot of these that you can buy at West Marine or whatever are automatically inflatable. They're designed for people who fall overboard on a boat. Well, that could be a really bad situation if you suddenly ditch your airplane and you're trying to get out and the damn thing inflates and you're like pinned to the top of the airplane. So I made sure that the one I got was you had to pull it to make it work, which means you have to be conscious, but I figured that was the lesser of the risks. An inflatable life raft, same kind of idea. You pull it and it inflates. A waterproof bag. I just had on the passenger seat a little waterproof bag that had a 24-hour flashing LED beacon that apparently you could see at a couple of miles. I have a personal locator beacon, which is like an ELT basically, that I hike with a lot, so I had that in there. I also had this device called the Garmin InReach, which I'll talk about in a second, which is also a satellite-based communication device, but it's a bidirectional. And it's something that if someone wants to buy you a nice gift, would be good to have in your flight bag anyway. And then I just had my handheld aviation radio, and then a little bit to eat, a little bit to drink. Probably should have put some, perhaps other beverages in there too, but compass, Leatherman, just some basic stuff. So this is that InReach. It's literally about that big. I should have brought it with me. And it is a subscription device, but it's a satellite communicator and a tracker. And so we were able to send this to Tom's wife, a link via text message, and we were able to send it to my parents and my wife, and they were able to just open up a link and see every 10 minutes it sends a point. The other nice thing is it connects to your phone, and so you basically have an application sort of like iMessage, and you can send messages back and forth. They maybe have a 2 or 3 minute delay, but it works great. I bought it right around Christmas, and so there was like a free month of whatever service plan you want, so I had the unlimited plan, and so I was like sitting up there having, I sent like 500 messages over the 20 hours of flying. So it worked great, and it was fun because it kept exact track of where I was and what I was doing. And I figured in an emergency, at least not only are you that someone knows that you're out floating, they know where you are, they know what you're doing, and they'll tell you when they're going to be there, so you know how to proceed. This is now getting into some more of the logistics of this. There's some planning and sort of just paperwork stuff that has to happen. You've got to have a U.S. Customs decal. Those are about $30. You buy them online, and it's per aircraft. So we have one for the year for 21 Delta. I forgot to bring it, but I'll give it to you, and we can just put it on. There's one from like 2006 or something.
So that's the old one.
The old one, yeah. The other thing is you have to have an EAPIS, it's called. So the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol uses this system called EAPIS, where you need to sign up as a pilot in advance. It takes a while to get approved. I had it, and it was still active from maybe 5 or 10 years ago when I used to fly down to Mexico. You go on there, and you basically put your manifest in there of who's on the airplane, what kind of citizenship they have, and so on. And you need to file one for each direction of your flight. So I'm leaving with these citizens from the country, and these are the ones that will be on the aircraft when I come back in. It makes sense. You can file it as far ahead of your trip as you want. It'll just sit there, and then it automatically activates for you. That's actually separate, though, from your international flight plans. And so you do have to say what time you're arriving on your EAPIS, and when you're coming back into the U.S., but you can always amend that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next couple of slides. The IFR flight, your flight plan, it's got to be an international border crossing plan. If you're IFR, it's really easy. It's just an IFR flight plan. If you're VFR, then it is a specific checkbox that says international flight crossing plan. You can do it through ForeFlight or flightplan.com or whatever website you like to use. To fly over Cuba, you need a Cuban overflight permit. There are brokers that will get these for you. I think flightplan.com will get them for you. Or you can actually just email the Cubans directly, and they will email you back and tell you what your permit number is. It's a little tricky. If you are a private owner of an aircraft and you are the pilot and the aircraft is registered in your name, then for smaller aircraft, there are no fees associated with it. They did not end up charging me fees for us, which they normally would, because I told them that this was a flying club, and they gave me that they want to support general aviation, the Cubans, apparently, and so they gave a waiver on the fees, which is normally about $130 or something. it's a long story. They initially gave me the waiver and the email, and then when I switched call signs because I was going to take the Cirrus and then switch to 21 Delta, then they were trying to charge me, but now they seem to not be charging me anymore. So if you get a bill from the Cubans, Ron, just let me know and I'll take care of it.
You'll be the first guy I call.
Okay. So you get this permit. It's literally just an email, and you put that permit number into your international flight plan. And then Miami does this all the time, has a million airplanes going back and forth, many of the commercial, many of them, you could hear them on the radio, and so that's a pretty smooth process. Lots of these things called general declaration forms, which I'll talk about in a minute. I basically took all these forms and put them into this binder, which you guys are welcome to look at. But it's these forms that basically just say, like, who the pilot is, who the co-pilot is, who the passengers were, and you'll need lots and lots of these forms because every little office you go and visit on arrival, like the customs office and the immigration office and the who knows what the heck they do in these various offices and at the foreign airports, they want one of the copies. You just bring a million of them, just have them photocopied. And then the international radio station license, 21 Delta has one, so I got lucky. I can't get a straight answer from anybody as to whether it's truly required anymore. I think it's a relic of the past, and I had several people say, you don't need it. No one ever asked me for it, but I did have it. Charts and, of course, insurance, and our insurance, we read the fine print, and that covers us throughout the Caribbean. Feel free to interrupt with questions, by the way. There are several kind of organizations that help with flying to all parts of the world. Like, for example, in Mexico, there's the Baja Bush pilots, and then this is one of the several over the Caribbean and the Bahamas. And this guy, I think it's a little organization / his business. It's sort of a tourism business. Like if you want to take a trip to Cuba with him and and 20 or 50 other airplanes, you can go. But this guy who runs this, his name's Jim Parker, and he was an invaluable resource. I called him on the phone a couple times and emailed back and forth with him. He'll also, you have to join this thing. It's like $40, but then he'll be the broker of your Cuban permit and make it a little easier. And he goes down there a couple of times a year and goes to the office and brings them, Christmas gifts and stuff. So they really like him, and he's quite helpful in working out any issue that you might have, like this thing where they tried to charge me. I emailed Jim, and Jim took care of it. So these guys are highly recommended. There's also an AOPA book that gets published, I think, every year or every other year, and there's one for the Bahamas, one for the Caribbean, and it's like a AFD. I mean, it has all the information about all the airports. They talk about entry procedures, exit procedures, what's specific for that country. They talk about the U.S. requirements and the foreign requirements, and it's a really, really good book. I ended up getting like the digital copy on my iPad, and it was a pain in the butt because their application sucks. So I would buy the real thing. I told you I'd talk a little bit about weather. All of the countries have their own weather services with good quality radar imaging, and they do predictions and prog charts and so on. And so this was the one for the Grand Caymans, which was very helpful. And this is just a screenshot, but you could scroll down and see the much more zoomed in radar images. And it's primarily down there in the tropics, a lot of pop-up thunderstorms and stuff like that. So this was really useful. And then this is the one from Cuba. And so it's very, very helpful. And you'll see I have a picture. I was actually able to go into the National Weather Service for Grand Cayman Islands is located in the General Aviation Terminal at the airport. And so you could go in and get an in-person briefing, and they were super, super helpful. I have a few pictures of that coming up. So, things are out of order. Great, let's talk about leaving the U.S. So, basically the procedure is you file your EAPIS anytime you want to do that. You file your flight plan, and I just did it right through ForeFlight. It was just like flying from here to Terre Haute. It's no big deal. You put in your Cuba overflight in that plan. You activate your flight plan. That's going to be pretty automatic if you're going IFR, but you can do some of these routes VFR. You fly. And then when you get there, you start handing out general declaration forms. Basically, there are these things called handlers, which I was not familiar with. But there are these people who will charge you a ton of money to be like, stand here, give them this, who will run your paperwork all around for you. And in Grand Cayman, it was like $300 or something. And I don't know why anybody would do it. I mean, I just stood there and smiled, and it maybe took 30 minutes. They point you here, and you sit here, and then you have a nice conversation with this guy, and then they send you over here, and you just keep going wherever they point you. And it was super easy. So if you have any amount of patience and you think that's sort of fun to meet local people and stuff, then I would say ditch the handlers and save yourself some money. Apparently some parts of the Caribbean have their own sort of EAPIS type thing. I didn't have to use it because I guess Grand Cayman doesn't participate. So that was in that, I read about it in that AOPA book. Coming en route, not a whole lot to know, but over Cuba, you talk to Havana approach, and then Cayo Largo approach, and then they send you off south of there, they'll send you to Grand Cayman approach. When you're over Cuba, I was told that there was no radar, but that wasn't really true. Cayo Largo in particular had me on radar. There's no ADS-B, but you do get a ADS-B of all the airliners that are overhead. When you're over Cuba, it's flight level, so you need to remember to set your altimeter as such. And then even though when they do have you on radar, they love position reports, and so you just have to remember, okay, where you are, who you are, where you are, what time is it, what's your altitude, and then where are you going, and what time do you expect to actually get there. And the convenient thing is in ForeFlight, it just has this lovely thing that you can basically read off, and it tells you your ETA everywhere you're going. The other thing to expect, and I was caught with my shorts down on this one, but was the millibars conversion. If you're going to fly down there, have on your clipboard what QNH is equal to what millimeters of or inches of mercury, because all the controllers will tell you because they know that you're like an idiot and that you need that. So, but yeah. So they'll tell you, but like if you're listening to an ATIS or something, you'll be scratching your head if you don't have that conversion table. Coming back into the U.S., you've got to depart from a foreign airport of entry. So if you've landed at Grand Cayman, the main island, and then spent your vacation at one of the smaller islands, you can't leave to come back from the smaller islands, even if you have sufficient fuel. You've got to go back to the main one and then come home. You need your ForeFlight plan, and it's pretty amazing. You put in your plan, and then you show up at the airport, and they've got it like printed out for you when you pay your bill, and you go through those like 15 offices again. They've got it printed out just like the little strip that you would expect to see. And I filed the route, which I had been told was the right route to fly, and it was the wrong route. And so I just stood there in the airport on the Wi-Fi and refiled, and it printed out on the printer. And he's like, "Oh, great, perfect." And then he sent me through. You do your immigration and pay your fees, your landing fees, and so on. You can get your weather there, and then you need to call on the phone and advise U.S. Customs of your arrival time. That's one of the things that was useful about, because they like you to be pretty close in terms of your arrival time for the customs back in the U.S., and that's what you filed on your EAPIS. So you could say, I'm going to be there at 6, and then if it turns out you can be there at 3, you can advise them within 1 hour that you're going to be there at 3. And so the nice thing with that Garmin... Sorry about that. Is that over the radio? You can do it over the radio through Miami radio, or if you're in other parts of the border, like when we used to come from Baja, we'd call San Diego radio. The problem is sometimes, it sort of depends how fast you're going, but sometimes it's hard to get the distance so that you have the adequate 1 hour warning. And so they kind of work with you, but they get a little bit touchy about it. What I ended up doing was I did call them before I left. I ended up hitting headwinds, and I just wanted to be sure that I was okay, and so I texted through the Garmin InReach and told one of my friends who's a pilot, I said, "Hey, would you mind just calling them and telling them?" And they were perfectly happy with that, so that you can kind of do a three-way thing. So that's the international flight plan, and then basically you just have to land at the airport of entry, and there's different types of airports of entry, but basically you have to land at the first one that you're going to cross. So you can't say, "Oh, I'm going to fly all the way up to Charlotte," and have crossed over a whole bunch of the U.S. I think the commercial airliners can do that. The GA planes, we're not allowed to do that. some of the airports of entry, like turns out Marathon is a privately run or franchise or something of the CBP, of the Border Patrol, and so they end up charging you some fees to use that one. Other ones are not a charge at all. So there's our trusty Tom, and this is in Chattanooga, just picking up some fuel and get on the way to barbecue. There we are at Perry Foley. That is a very nice airport, cheap gas. I ended up flying down at 13,000, I think I was. That's about as high as I could get that airplane to go. And just because I was a little nervous and figured if I'm going to have to ditch, I might as well have as much time as possible. So I had oxygen on.
What was your manifold pressure?
What was that?
What was the manifold pressure?
Really low. Really low. And my fuel economy was fantastic. I didn't use much fuel at all. So that is the Bahia de Cochinos, Bay of Pigs, on the south side of Cuba. It's just Cayo Largo is kind of off to the right there. That's actually Cayo Largo right over it. And I mean, there's actually quite a bit of aviation traffic, not just passing overhead Cuba, but I mean, there were a bunch of like 737s that were taking off and coming and going from Cayo Largo in the south. I actually talked to Havana approach, but then as I got over the land, they shifted me to a different approach controller. So I didn't hear all the planes coming in going from Havana, but there's quite a bit of traffic over Cuba, most of which was above me. You know, for all my being nervous about being over the water, there were actually quite a few ships out there, both north and south of Cuba. And so if I had had an issue, I just would have, you know, put my eyes right on one of those ships and landed right in parallel to them. So, you know, even when you say, well, you're going to be X number of minutes sort of on your own, maybe yes, maybe no. There are people out there that would come and get you, I think. That's approaching Grand Cayman there. That's the east end of the island. Unfortunately, I have a bunch of pretty neat GoPro shots, and all the ones I accidentally deleted that I had for approach, which were the better of them. But I have some good ones from leaving. I had the GoPro mounted up on the dash. So that's when we arrived. It was like high season down there. I mean, it was like cranking. They were having an airplane land every 2 minutes. They were real. I actually canceled IFR as soon as I was outside of Cuban airspace because otherwise they were going to vector me off and put me in a hold in the middle of nowhere, and I just wanted to not do that. So, and they were pretty happy with that, in part because, you know, they had me out there circling over the cruise ships. And I was like, yeah, sure, let the Southwest go, let the Delta guy go, and then they put me in. And they were very accommodating, very nice. It's a towered airport. They do not have any radar there, and so it's a lot of, how many miles are you out from this? What's your bearing to, and so they just space everybody in that way. And you could see, I mean, there were like, I don't know, 15 Gulfstream 4s on the, just like packed in like sardines all over, and 2-1 Delta had a very nice spot on the grass. I brought tie downs with me because they did not have. There were some old ones, but I ended up using mine. That's the General Aviation Terminal, and that's their little radar dome up on the top. They would have been very happy to, you know, carry your bags in for $300, but I used those free carts right there. And this is the island area. So this is the FBO. And so if you pay the handling fees, you get to use the FBO. I popped in there very briefly to pay for fuel, and it was underwhelming. So looked nice. I mean, they had nice, looked like they had very good facilities for maintaining planes and stuff. But I can't imagine wanting to spend a ton more time in there. That's just the fire department, and you can see all the commercial planes lined up. I mean, United, Alaska, everybody flies in there. So it's a pretty busy airport. That's the Grand Cayman Weather Service. A very nice guy gave me my briefing. On the top picture there along the wall, that's like all your winds aloft, and they print that stuff out every day, and they put it up on the clipboards. And so you go clipboard to get your briefing. Granted, most of that information is available on ForeFlight, so I didn't spend a lot of time with the clipboards, but it is pretty useful. And then that is behind this guy here on the other screen down below. You've got satellite imagery and radar. And the nice thing about it is there were some cells on the day that I was departing, And he was really able to overlay on his maps exactly the routing. So he said, look, they're going to give you this routing. You're going to fly right up this corridor. Those cells are this way, and they're moving that way. But and that was really hard to tell on the sort of freely available updating web pages. I mean, you could kind of like go, well, I think I'm going to be about there. But he was able to say, that waypoint is here, and you're going to be 20 miles off of that storm or whatever. So that was the end of it. There were lots of flights. I guess I forgot to put a few. I had a nice sunset picture and so on. But the flight back was pretty uneventful and really nice. Flying up the coast of Florida, went up the east coast of Florida, had a beautiful sunset, and then was at night. But there are just it's incredible how many airports there are up that east coast all the way into Charlotte pretty much. And I must have had 100 or 120 miles of visibility at one point. I mean, you could just see forever and ever all the way up the coast. So it was really lovely. So if anyone wants to look at this book or ask questions, they're welcome. I found it very useful. I had like a letter from Ron that said, I wasn't hijacking or stealing the airplane. I had our airworthiness, because sometimes they do want to look at that stuff. Couple copies of everything in case they want it, then you can just hand it off, because
Just a comment that letter is something that you have to have if you fly to Canada. They just want to have authorization that you're the person that's supposed to be flying that airplane.
They didn't ask for it in the end, but I think it might have been useful. I could see several circumstances where it would be useful. This was just our Indiana registration. This was that FCC radio station permit for the airplane. Our registration, the FAA registration, copy of my pilot's license, medical. And they do actually, they did like to see the medical and the pilot's license back when you land in the US. The customs people asked for it. This was if you were to have to file your flight plan on paper, which you could do down in Grand Cayman. If you didn't use ForeFlight or flightplan.com, then you would file this one. Which I didn't end up using. This is general declaration, which just says where you're going to, where you're coming from, and who's on board. And there's some questions about like if anyone has a communicable disease. So if you have TB, maybe don't go. International flight plan. That's just copies of that. And then I had in Mexico, they asked to see your insurance policy, and so I had a copy of it with me. They didn't ask for it at all. They're pretty relaxed down there. I think they're pretty tourist friendly. And then they hadn't actually sent me the sticker for the customs, but if you make a last minute trip or something and they haven't sent you your sticker, which takes a couple weeks to come in the mail, they're happy just to have the payment confirmation when you show up at customs. Turns out that their processing center is in Indianapolis, so when I called them, they were very, very nice. They said, "Oh, you're local." I said, "Yes, I am." And then I wasn't really planning to use them, but I did get a copy of the approach plates for Grand Cayman Islands, and those are not too difficult to get your hands on. So that was it. It was a fun trip. Feel free to, yeah.
Your experiences going to Mexico probably put you in a good position to do this trip.
Yeah.
For someone who's never done one, what's your main resource for knowing what forms to fill out?
Yeah.
And how long ahead of time
to do it?
Start planning?
I would probably get this this book from the AOPA. It's really comprehensive. I assume the real paper version of it would be pretty thick. It has all the airports and the frequencies. Frankly, that stuff's in ForeFlight anyway, but it does have really nice descriptions of every form you're going to need. What is an example of a general declaration? It has, checklists, because there are a bunch of different things and a bunch of different moving parts, and it has checklists of what you're going to need on entry to the U.S., exit from the U.S. So it's I would say that's probably one of the best resources, actually.
And then this person you mentioned.
This guy?
Yeah, that guy. He helped you a lot, you said.
Yeah, and he was also really helpful. And whether, if it's your first time flying internationally, I imagine that one of his organized trips would probably, and I don't think he just goes to Cuba. I think he does in Bahamas and so on as well. I know he does for sure a Grand Cayman trip, actually. I imagine that that would be a pretty good way to go because they're going to manage a lot of it for you and help you through the process.
But your foreflight had charts, not charts, but had the nav data, right?
Yep. ForeFlight has all of it.
So even though we don't update our Garmin in town for VFR, you were legal to use
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, definitely.
Which raises a question. One of your slides said charts. Are you required to have paper charts?
No, you're not. But you can, I guess I was using that sort of liberally.
So
Yeah, you're not
that was
required.
neat with the controllers.
Perfect.
Was.
Yeah, not an issue at all.
They fly with a lot of.
Yeah, I mean, there's like overhead. My wife, who clearly doesn't trust me, decided to fly Southwest, and so I actually have a screenshot of the ADSB picking up her Southwest flight overhead. So I was listening to them, yeah, but they're totally perfect English. You hear a lot of Spanish because if it's a domestic flight, they'll speak in Spanish. But they're all ICAO airports, and of course Grand Cayman's an English-speaking country, so that's not a problem at all.
Did she fly back with you? You solo all the way back then?
Yeah. Well, I had Tom on the way down, and then I went back. I was hoping to convince her to come back. I thought she was going to, and she said, "No way, I've had enough."
You rent your life raft and your.
Yeah. So nobody's allowed to judge me too significantly. I put hours into trying to rent a life raft, and utterly failed. I finally got to someone who said they would rent it, and then they figured out that I wasn't going to rent the airplane with the life raft, and they said, no, thank you. And so I rented it from West Marine. I bought it and just returned it when I got home. So.
I mean, a two-man life raft?
I actually had a 4-man because I figured, I've been bulking up lately, but yeah, it was an amazing little machine. I didn't deploy it because I didn't want to pay $1,200, but it was about this big by about that big by about that big, and it was rated for that. There are all different. I did a lot of reading on life rafts. There are all different kinds of life rafts. Some of them have canopies. Some of them don't have canopies. Some are rated for high seas or not high seas. My feeling was that the first thing is the water down there is quite warm. And your exposure time is going to be quite short if you have all the equipment that we have. And there's enough boats out there that they're going to pick you up. And I was also told by several people that the Coast Guard actually operates even south of Cuba. They'll send a C-130. Now, whether that's 100% true, I can't say for sure, but that area was very clear to me that it was well-traveled and well-patrolled. And so mine was probably not the highest rated sea thing, but I also wanted something relatively compact, not just to travel with, but if I had to get it out of the door of the airplane. So West Marine is now irritated in Indianapolis. They have this thing because apparently, who's going to go and buy it there? And I don't know if they can send it back to headquarters. But so if anyone wants to take a trip, it's available.
That's awesome.
It's available to you.
That's really cheap rental.
Yeah, now you understand.
I understand.
Yeah, right. I put in good faith trying to rent one, and it's just not. There's a couple people online who say they do it and they don't. I mean, I probably spent 4 hours on it.
I thought you were gonna say we were judging you because you didn't get one, but no, you're.
Oh no, you're judging me because I'm a cheap bastard. Yeah.
That's probably better than a wedding dress you returned.
Yeah.
So, did you try in Florida to rent?
Yeah. I call all around to Tamiami, Pagefield. I mean, all the major Marathon, and then they even referred me over to some yacht rental companies. There's just, and maybe it exists, and it's just a local. I called executive, and I called 3 places there. None of the FBOs knew about it. They told me that in the olden days there was this company that would bring them and drop them off at whatever airport you were going to be departing from, and then you would leave it on your re-entry. And actually I was able to find the old website for this company, and I think they folded. I don't know if it wasn't profitable or what. So,
Are you going to do this again?
when my bank account and my wife will let me someday, I would love to. It's just totally gorgeous flying down there. I mean, to be in the warm weather and to have some of these views, like you fly. I came back at a little bit lower altitude for weather, and just looking down at the oceans and the reefs and stuff, you can see unbelievable how clear the water is.
It's nice to have a lot faster airplane.
Yes, that is true. It is a long haul.
Why did you end up doing 2-1 Delta instead of the Cirrus?
It was booked up. Yeah.
What again was your time frame for finding all this as far as starting the paperwork for you? A couple months?
Great question. EAPIS, I don't know what the time frame to get set up on EAPIS because I had that, and I think that there is a couple of week delay for that. Oh, do we need to get out of here? But the rest of the paperwork you could probably do within 3 weeks if you wanted to, and or even less.
I think we're okay, folks.
Oh, okay.
because, that's one of the reasons I suggested meeting here is
Okay.
they can lock up and we can go out the door.
Okay.
I think we're good.
Yeah, but it's pretty quick actually. The longest, I mean, Cuba responded within maybe 2 days. Your EAPIS that you file, you could file it the same day if you really needed to. Your flight plans are same day. So it's mostly the logistics of getting, all of this kind of stuff printed out, put in a binder, all the, having a little waterproof bag that has your survival gear and gathering that together.
So when did you come up with this idea and
Uh,
relative to your trip?
I came up with the idea about I think it was 6 months almost to the day before the trip. I don't know how I came up with it. It was kind of a harebrained idea, but it was a pre-planned family trip that was happening down there with my in-laws and siblings and stuff. So everyone was going, and so if I would have been late, my head would have gotten chopped off. And so I had every backup out possible with Southwest flights and so on. But the weather was great, and so I got lucky and was able to do it. But and so I had done, I guess, some of the legwork up ahead of time, and just I'd say Matt, to answer your question, like the learning part of it, like figuring out what you need is probably the biggest part of it. It's not actually getting what you need.
Awesome presentation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks everyone for coming and listening. If